I'm Wendi Coker with the Betty and Leonard Phillips Deaf Action Center in Shreveport, Louisiana. You may have already hired, or maybe you're considering hiring, a deaf, deafblind, or hard of hearing person to work at your facility. You may or may not have worked with an interpreter before. Possibly one has been requested, or you're considering hiring a deaf individual and you're doing your homework. Whatever the case may be, we're here to help you. What is an interpreter and why do you need one? Well, an interpreter is a trained individual that facilitates communication between a person who does not know ASL and a deaf person whose means of communication is ASL, American Sign Language. Make sure when hiring an interpreter that they're professional and competent, one who has the appropriate credentials and background that can actually come in and facilitate effective communication. Now, you may have a tendency to want to request that the deaf individual bring a friend or a family member to come with them and help you communicate. This is not appropriate, and it's also not acceptable under the Americans with Disability Act. The reason behind this is it's because it's a conflict of interest. So protect yourself by hiring a professional. It is also your legal responsibility to cover the cost as outlined in the ADA law. You cannot expect the deaf person to pay for these services themselves. So make sure you study the ADA law so that you know your legal obligations. Now here's a quick glance at what the law requires. I'm going to put up a slide and give you just a brief minute so that you can look over it. Now after reading it, and if you have any further questions, you can also contact the Americans with Disability Act at 1-800-514-0301. Now, I'm going to put this slide up so that you can look at it. When you call, now they are very helpful and willing to answer any questions that you may have. One misconception that that people have about American Sign Language is that it's English on the hands, and this is not the case. American Sign Language is a visual language that has its own grammatical structure. It consists of hand gestures, non-manual markers such as facial expressions, head movements, shoulder raises, mouth morphemes, and movement of the body. It's not a written or a spoken language. Therefore, writing back and forth with the person that you're interviewing or trying to have a conversation with may not always be appropriate. ASL interpreters also serve as cultural mediators, bringing any gaps between deaf and hearing culture so that both parties can feel that they have a full understanding of the message being relayed. Now, do understand that interpreters aim to provide objective interpretations, but they are deaf culture allies and they will advocate for the deaf client if needed. Once you work with a professional interpreter, you'll never want to go without one again. So let's talk about, where do you find an interpreter? Well, you can find a professional interpreter at a local agency that serves deaf, hard of hearing, deafblind. You can also visit the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf, which is RID. You can visit their website at rid.org. At the top of the page, you would click on Search Tools. Then you would scroll down to where it says Find an Interpreter, Agency, or Referral Service. So that's one way. Or you can also get on the internet and find, like I said, the local agencies in your area. Now, when you call to schedule an interpreter, you need to make sure you have all the information that they're going to need. Also be aware that when you contact an agency, they're probably going to ask you to enter into an agreement with them. So this is a good idea because it puts you in compliance with the accessibility laws. But before calling the agency, make sure that you have all the information related to the assignment. Information that you may need to prepare when you call is you're going to need the date, time, deaf individual's name, where the meeting will be, where it will occur, the address, the person that they need to make contact with, the point of contact, and also a phone number that they can call back. And also, they're going to ask you approximately how long the assignment will be. Now, depending on which agency you use, the time may vary, but anything over an hour and a half will require 2 interpreters. They will also need to know what type of assignment this is: staff meeting, a job interview, benefits meeting, etc. Now, most agencies require a certain amount of notice when requesting interpreters. An example would be that we require a 3-day notice. But you'll need to check with your local agency to see what their requirements are. Now, it may be hard to acquire an interpreter last minute, so just keep that in mind. Now, let's recap what we just learned. We just talked about what a sign language interpreter is. So it's a trained individual that facilitates communication between a person who does not know sign language and a deaf person whose means of communication is sign language. They're also a cultural mediator that bridges any gaps between the deaf and hearing culture so that all parties can fully understand the message being relayed. Now that we've covered those 2 things, we've talked about why you need one and about how to find one, let's discuss how to appropriately work with one once you get them there. Now, you want to remember and understand that the interpreter is there to facilitate communication. You do not want to talk to the interpreter like the deaf person isn't there. The interpreter must, and I'm going to repeat, must interpret everything that is said. Do not ever say, oh, you don't have to interpret this. Again, they must. They are required to interpret everything being said in the presence of a deaf person. If you have something that you do not want the deaf person to know, then you'll need to go outside of the room, outside to where they cannot see you to say that, because the interpreter will need to stay with the deaf individual at all times. Okay, never ask them to step outside to talk privately. Remember, they're there only to facilitate communication between you and the deaf individual. You do not want to ask the interpreter things such as, oh, how long have you been interpreting? Do you teach classes? What may you get into, how may you get into the field? How do you sign this or how do you sign that? This is not going to be the appropriate time to engage in any type of one-on-one conversation with the interpreter. Again, remember, they're there to facilitate communication between you and the deaf person. Now, it's normal to be amazed with sign language. It's a fascinating language and it's beautiful. This is just not the appropriate time to ask such questions. Now, of course, if you're interested in learning, call your local agency to find out more information. I'm sure they'll be glad to assist you. Also, the interpreter is not a helper. They're not there to fill out the deaf individual's paperwork or to take care of their private business. They cannot interject with any personal opinions, any advice of any kind. They are strictly there to interpret. You want to talk directly to the deaf person, making eye contact with them. Do not talk to the deaf person in third-party language, such as tell them or tell her. This confuses the message. Remember, they're the one that you're having the conversation with, so talk directly to them. Make sure to speak clearly as possible. using regular voice tone and at a normal speed. Mumbling or shouting or over-enunciating your words, it only makes the interpreter's job a little harder. Now, the interpreter will tell you if you need to slow down. You don't have to stop and say, am I going too fast? They're going to let you know. Now, if you use a word that the interpreter may not be familiar with, he or she may ask you to spell it. Now, oftentimes, businesses also have acronyms that they use or words that relate directly to your business. The interpreter may or may not know these acronyms, so it's best practice not to use an acronym unless you've already provided the interpreter with a list of those prior to the assignment. So you always want to fully say the acronym. Don't just do your little shortcuts. Say the full word so the interpreter gets it right. Now, do not speak to the deaf person like they're uneducated. Remember, their language is not spoken and it's not a written language. This sometimes causes a little bit of a misunderstanding, so do not let their language, just because it's different, lead you to believe that a deaf person's uneducated, because that's simply not true. You just have to remember that their language is full of gestures, facial expressions, head movements, shoulder raises, mouth morphemes, and body movement. So it's very different. It's a totally different structure than what English is. Okay? A different language is the only difference between you and the deaf individual. Now, you want to make sure that you have the room set up appropriately. This is very important. You want to make sure you have your seating set up right, your lighting. You're going to also want to make sure that there is no cross-talking if there's more than one person doing the interview or if they're in a meeting. You want to place the interpreter next to the hearing person who will be speaking. You don't want to try to place the interpreter next to the deaf person because that's not going to work. The deaf person needs to be able to see the person speaking to them as well as the interpreter. If this is a large meeting, place the deaf in an area that's in front. You do not want to put them in the back of the room. This isolates them and also makes it hard for the interpreter to hear what's going on. It's hard for the deaf individual to see what's going on. You also want to make sure that there's appropriate lighting. This is very important. The deaf have to be able to see clearly. A dark room basically shuts off all communication for them. Now, if you plan on turning down the lights, you need to make sure that you have the appropriate lighting that's on the interpreter. If this is a meeting with several people involved, make sure that the group knows, and this is going to be your responsibility, but you need to make sure that they understand that it's important that they talk one at a time, no cross-talking, because this is going to make it difficult for the interpreter to keep up. If there's several people trying to speak at once, this is going to cause information to be just lost, and it also may cause the deaf individual to become frustrated. It can be helpful to ask people to raise their hands before speaking. That kind of helps you have control of the meeting. You will need to make this announcement prior to starting the meeting. You also may be a little bit concerned about confidentiality. Interpreters are held to a professional code of conduct that has been established by the Registry of Interpreters for the deaf. It emphasizes ethics and client confidentiality, very important, and each interpreter has a clear understanding of their role. This is another reason that you want to hire a professional. You want to make sure that whoever's doing this job has a clear understanding of their role. Now, I'm going to show you a quick slide of the Code of Professional Conduct that we're required to follow. I think this is going to help ease your mind just a tad. I want to personally thank you for taking the time to watch this video and educating yourself on how to work with your deaf employee. Just remember to relax. Using an interpreter can be very comfortable and very productive. Remember that we're there to help make this experience smooth. Thank you for joining me.